Bluegrass Airport, Kentucky, 6:07 a.m. A runway, a darkness the crew was fully prepared for. 49 dead, one survivor who will never walk again, and can never remember why. The number was right there, glowing on the panel. They had said it themselves, they never looked. How does the one document designed to keep them safe become the reason they never saw it coming? Here is what the last few seconds looked like. The engines are at full power. Outside, almost no runway lights, just a narrow cone of white from the landing lights cutting into the black. 10 seconds into the roll, the first officer says something. Not a warning, just a quiet observation. That's weird, with no lights. The captain says, yeah, that is the end of it. 20 seconds later, the pavement runs out. Not gradually. The runway simply ends, far sooner than it was ever supposed to. The nose pulls up. The main gear is still on the ground. The aircraft clips a structure beyond the threshold, and the landing gear tears away. For 1 second, the CRJ is airborne, damaged, losing energy, terrain rising ahead. Then it is not. The wreckage ignites before anyone in the cabin has time to move. Of the 50 people on board, 49 did not survive. The one man who lived would never walk unassisted again. Brain trauma erased his memory of the flight entirely. The one person who could explain what happened inside that cockpit lost that answer on impact. The crew were not tired. They were not untrained. They had done everything experienced professionals were supposed to do, including carefully reading the one safety document that, without anyone realizing it, had just switched off the last alarm standing between them and that runway. This is Comair Flight 5191. Bluegrass Airport sits just outside Lexington, Kentucky, a mid-sized regional facility built around 2 intersecting runways and a modest terminal. For the commuters and business travelers passing through it in 2006, it was the kind of airport that felt almost domestic, familiar, easy. That familiarity mattered more than anyone realized. Comair 5191 was a short regional hop to Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta, roughly an hour in the air. Comair was a wholly owned subsidiary of Delta Airlines, operating under the Delta Connection brand, held to the same regulatory standards as any major carrier. To a passenger buying a ticket, it was simply a Delta flight on a smaller airplane. The aircraft was a Bombardier CRJ-100, registered N431CA, twin engine, 50 passengers, just over 14,000 flight hours, no deferred maintenance, ready to fly. The captain was 35. With Comair since 1999, upgraded to captain in 2004, approximately 4,710 total flight hours, more than 3,000 on the CRJ. He had flown in and out of Lexington before, including at night. The first officer was 44, with roughly 6,560 total hours, and prior experience as both a captain and a simulator instructor at another regional carrier. More experience than most first officers in the industry. Comair instructors described him as methodical and thorough. Both were regarded by colleagues as quiet, professional, and capable. Neither had any record of accidents or training deficiencies. They reported for duty at 5:15 a.m. Sunrise was still almost 2 hours away. Staff who interacted with them that morning noted nothing unusual. The departure runway was runway 22, Bluegrass Airport's main commercial runway, just over 7,000 feet, fully equipped with edge lighting, centerline lighting, and all visual infrastructure expected for airline operations. Every commercial aircraft that left Lexington used runway 22. Crossing it at an angle on the way out from the ramp was runway 26, 3,500 feet long, intended exclusively for small general aviation aircraft. No edge lighting, no approach lighting system. Its usable painted width was half that of runway 22. Roughly 2% of total traffic at Bluegrass ever used it. Controllers did not associate it with commercial operations. The connecting taxiway was Taxiway Alpha. Under normal conditions, roll from the gate, cross straight over runway 26 without stopping, continue a few hundred feet, hold short of runway 22. No complex intersections, no sharp turns. Crews who knew Lexington treated this route as nearly automatic. But the airport was under construction. The section of Taxiway Alpha, beyond runway 26, had been closed for reconstruction, rerouting the final approach to runway 22 through a path requiring a sharper left turn than pilots had made for years. The muscle memory of that final lineup was no longer accurate. And then there was the notice. A NOTAM, a notice to airmen, an official safety document issued to inform crews of conditions that differ from published charts, stated that the runway end identifier lights on runway 22 were out of service. These are the lights that mark the threshold of a runway and help pilots confirm they are lined up on the right one. They were dark that morning. The crew discussed this during pre-flight. The first officer mentioned he had personally seen similar conditions on a recent arrival into Lexington. They noted it, acknowledged it, adjusted their mental picture. They were ready. That adjustment, made carefully from the flight deck of a parked regional jet, would become the most consequential thing either pilot did that morning. To understand why that NOTAM mattered so much, you need to understand what runway lighting actually does for a pilot at night. Not as an aesthetic feature, but as a navigation tool. When an aircraft lines up on a runway after dark, the edge lights define the corridor. Two parallel rows of white lights stretching ahead give the crew an immediate sense of width, alignment, and depth. The center line lights confirm tracking. The threshold lights confirm which runway end they are on. Together, these systems create a picture the brain processes almost automatically. A visual signature that says this is the right place, and I am pointed the right way. When that picture is missing, the brain does not go blank. It fills the gap. It reaches for the nearest available explanation and holds on to it. And on the morning of August 27, 2006, the crew of Flight 5191 had been handed exactly the explanation their brains would need. The NOTAM said the lights on runway 22 were out. Darkness ahead was not a warning. It was an expected condition, filed, noted, and absorbed. Just after 6 a.m., with both engines running and the cockpit configured for taxi, the first officer contacted ground control and requested taxi clearance. The controller responded simply, Comair 5191, taxi to runway 22. Under the procedures in place at Bluegrass Airport at the time, that clearance implicitly authorized the aircraft to cross runway 26 along taxiway Alpha without any separate instruction. The crew did not need to call out the crossing. The controller did not need to issue a specific clearance for it. In practice, this meant that the mental distinction between the taxiway and the crossing runway was never formally reinforced. Pilots were expected to simply roll over it and keep going. The captain released the brakes, and the CRJ began moving. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was relaxed. Checklist items were called and acknowledged. Radios were monitored, and the aircraft moved steadily through a quiet airport. But the cockpit voice recorder also captured something else, a conversation that had nothing to do with the aircraft, the airport, or the departure. The two pilots had picked up a discussion that had started earlier in the morning about pay rates, working conditions, and hours at their airline and at competitors. Sterile cockpit rules, both FAA regulations and Comair's own procedures, prohibited exactly this type of non-essential talk during taxi and other critical phases of flight. The rule exists because ground movement requires continuous position awareness, tracking their exact location, confirming signage, maintaining an accurate mental picture of where the aircraft actually is. That process competes directly with conversation. Neither pilot called it out. The talk continued. Meanwhile, lit signs on the taxiway sides clearly identified the runways ahead. The painted numbers on the pavement marked each threshold. None of it was hidden. But signage only works when someone is actively reading it. In the cabin, 47 passengers settled into their seats, some reading, some already dozing, some watching the darkness outside the oval windows. None of them had any reason to think about the runway outside. Then the aircraft slowed and stopped. It came to a halt just short of the holding point for runway 26, the small general aviation strip that taxiway Alpha was supposed to cross without pausing. Under the taxi clearance the crew had received, there was no reason to stop here. The correct action was to roll straight across and continue to the holding point for runway 22, a few hundred feet further down. But the aircraft stopped, and inside the cockpit nobody said anything. There was no position call-out, no verbal check of the runway identifier on the sign to their left, no question from either pilot asking where they were. The stop folded seamlessly into the ongoing conversation, unremarked and unexamined. What happened in that moment? The precise cognitive shift that investigators would later spend months trying to locate was this. Both pilots' mental models quietly jumped. They had been thinking they were approaching the crossing point of runway 26. Now, having stopped, they were thinking they were at the holding point for runway 22. The airport's layout, the expected simplicity of the route, the darkness, and the distraction of conversation had blurred the gap between those two positions until it disappeared. They were at the wrong runway, and they had no idea. There was also a physical dimension to this error that made it harder to catch. Under normal conditions, taxiway Alpha extended beyond runway 26, bending gently left before making another gradual left turn to line up with runway 22. Pilots who flew out of Lexington regularly had made that final turn hundreds of times. It was the kind of maneuver that lived in the hands as much as the mind. But that section of taxiway Alpha had been closed for construction. The new routing required a sharper left turn at a different point, and the steering input needed to enter runway 26 from where the aircraft had stopped was almost identical to the input that had previously led to runway 22. The muscle memory that should have felt wrong felt right. At this moment, there was one more layer of protection that could have caught everything. A second pair of eyes in the control tower. The lone controller on duty had been working since midnight, after only a few hours of sleep. He was responsible not only for ground movements and takeoff clearances at Bluegrass, but also for radar coordination in the surrounding airspace, and a mandatory traffic count that had to be completed before the end of his shift. FAA guidance at the time indicated that combining tower and radar responsibilities should require 2 controllers, but that standard was poorly defined and inconsistently applied. Overnight and early morning shifts at Bluegrass regularly ran with just 1 person. At the moment Flight 5191 stopped at the runway 26 holding point, the controller's attention was on his radar scope and his flight strips. He was coordinating a handoff for an aircraft that had just departed. He was also completing his traffic count. He never looked up. He never saw the aircraft sitting motionless at the wrong runway for nearly a minute. A minute is a long time when nothing else is moving. Now, here is what should have happened. When the aircraft reached the runway 26 threshold, the captain should have called out the runway identifier. Both pilots should have confirmed they were crossing, not holding at, runway 26. When they reached the runway 22 holding point, a second call-out should have confirmed their position. These steps were not exotic. They were standard operating discipline. But none of them happened. And there was still one more gate, perhaps the most reliable one of all. Before any takeoff, the crew had set their heading bugs, small markers on the primary flight display that a pilot dials to the planned departure heading as a reference for immediately after liftoff. For runway 22, that heading was 227 degrees. Both pilots had set their bugs correctly. The number was there, glowing quietly on both instrument panels. Runway 26 pointed in a heading of approximately 262 degrees, roughly 40 degrees away from runway 22. 40 degrees is not a subtle discrepancy. On a compass, it is the difference between southwest and west. Had either pilot glanced at their heading indicator and compared it to the bug they had just set, the mismatch would have been immediate and unambiguous. The instruments were not malfunctioning. The information was accurate. It was simply not being looked at. Comair's procedures at the time required crews to set the heading bugs for the departure runway. That step had been completed. What the procedures did not require was the next step, a positive cross-check to confirm that the aircraft's actual heading matched the bug. The FAA had recommended that operators include exactly this kind of explicit verification for precisely this type of scenario. Comair had not adopted that recommendation. The information was there. The verification step was not. If you are keeping track of the gates that have now closed, the position call-out that never came, the signage that went unread, the heading cross-check that was never required, understand that any single one of them would have been sufficient. Any one of these steps, completed as designed, would have broken the assumption before it became irreversible. But the cockpit of Flight 5191 had drifted far enough from disciplined monitoring that none of them fired. The crew's mental picture said runway 22. The darkness ahead said nothing to contradict it, and the one document that had officially told them to expect darkness had made sure of that. The first officer completed the before takeoff checklist. The aircraft was lined up. The captain handed control of the aircraft to the first officer, who called out, "My brakes, my controls." The captain replied, "Your controls." Outside the cockpit windows, there was no illuminated corridor stretching ahead, no parallel rows of edge lights tapering into the distance, just a narrow cone of white from the landing lights, reaching perhaps 200 or 300 feet into the black before dissolving into nothing. Runway 22 was dark that morning, according to the NOTAM, so this was normal. The first officer advanced the thrust levers. 6:07 a.m., full power. The CRJ accelerates hard down runway 26. The engines are loud. The airframe vibrates with the familiar rhythm of a takeoff roll. Nothing in the cockpit feels wrong. 10 seconds in. The speed is building. Outside, the landing lights carve a tunnel ahead. Narrow, shortened by the absence of edge lighting, but not alarming, not yet. Then the first officer speaks. "That's weird with no lights." It is not a call-out. It is not a warning. It is an observation that surfaces from somewhere below conscious thought, the part of a pilot's mind that tracks the physical environment even when attention is elsewhere. Something in the picture ahead does not match the stored template of what a takeoff roll is supposed to feel like. The first officer senses it. He says it aloud. The captain says, "Yeah." The thrust levers stay forward. To understand what that moment cost, consider the numbers. Runway 26 is 3,500 feet long. The CRJ-100 needed a minimum of around 4,500 feet to accelerate to rotation speed and lift off safely under the conditions that morning. Nearly 1,000 feet more than the runway beneath them. At the moment the first officer made his comment, the aircraft had already passed the point where a rejected takeoff, an emergency stop, could have been safely completed. The decision window had closed before anyone realized it existed. 15 seconds. 20. The speed climbs through 100 knots. The captain calls it. The first officer confirms, checks. Ahead, the cone of light is shortening. Not because the runway is ending soon by any normal measure, because the runway is ending now. The 3,500 feet of runway 26 are almost gone, and the aircraft is still on the ground, still accelerating, still not at rotation speed. The captain sees it first. His call comes out as a single word, compressed by urgency into something between a command and a plea. Rotate. The aircraft has not yet reached 142 knots, its calculated rotation speed. The actual speed at that moment is 131 knots, 11 knots short. The call is not a standard rotation call. It is a last attempt to force the aircraft into the air before the pavement disappears. Both pilots pull back on their controls simultaneously. The nose rises. For one fractured second, it seems as though the aircraft might respond. The CRJ's wings generating just enough lift to break the wheels free from the ground. But the main landing gear is still rolling when the pavement ends. The gear strikes a localizer antenna structure just beyond the runway threshold. The impact tears the landing gear clean away. For approximately 1 second, the aircraft is airborne. It is also fatally damaged, losing energy rapidly, with the dark terrain of the Kentucky countryside rising ahead of it. The CRJ clears the airport boundary and strikes a stand of trees. The impact with the ground beyond tears the airframe apart as it plows through the terrain, scattering wreckage across the field. The fuel ignites immediately. In the tower, the controller looks up from his radar scope. A jet departing runway 22 would be climbing straight ahead by now, visible for several seconds as a moving light against the sky. There is nothing. No aircraft. No radio call. Just silence from a frequency that should be busy. Of the 50 people on board Comair Flight 5191, 49 did not survive. The first officer was pulled from the wreckage alive. His injuries were catastrophic. He would never walk unassisted again, and he would never return to flying. The brain trauma he sustained erased his memory of the flight entirely. The one person who had been in that cockpit, who had felt the morning unfold from the inside, who had said those 4 quiet words 10 seconds before the runway ended, that person could not say why. He never could. The National Transportation Safety Board opened a full investigation. Investigators pulled the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder, radar data, and controller communications. What they found was not a single cause. It was a structure, a layered arrangement of small gaps, each one unremarkable in isolation, that had aligned with quiet precision. The crew's failure to verify their runway before takeoff was the proximate cause. But investigators did not stop there, because stopping there explained almost nothing about why two experienced professionals had failed to perform a check that both of them knew to exist. The first contributing factor was the conversation. The voice recorder documented clearly that during the taxi from gate to runway, the crew had been engaged in talk about pay rates and working conditions, the kind of discussion that belongs in a break room, not in a moving aircraft. Sterile cockpit rules were designed specifically to prevent this. They were known. They were simply not followed. The second contributing factor was structural. Under the procedures in place at Bluegrass in 2006, a taxi clearance to runway 22 automatically authorized crossing runway 26 without any separate instruction. No call-out required. No explicit confirmation. This arrangement had worked without incident for years, which was precisely why nobody had questioned it. But what it had also done, quietly, over years of uneventful operations, was remove the one moment of forced awareness that might have interrupted a crew whose mental model had slipped. A controller saying cross runway 26 would have required the crew to acknowledge a runway. Acknowledging it required identifying it. Identifying runway 26 would have placed them, correctly, on the wrong side of it. That instruction was never given. It was never required. Then there was the NOTAM. Investigators noted that it had done everything it was supposed to do, issued correctly, received by the crew, discussed, and absorbed. And yet the information it contained had functioned, in practice, as an inoculation against the one sensory warning that might have stopped them. When the first officer said, "That's weird, with no lights," the NOTAM was already in his head, supplying the explanation before the alarm could fully form. This was not a failure of the NOTAM system. It was something harder to address. The way that accurate, professionally absorbed safety information can interact with expectation bias to suppress the alertness it was meant to support. In Atlanta, families had gone to the airport to meet a flight that was not going to arrive. Personal effects recovered from the wreckage. Bags, books, items packed for journeys that were never completed, were cataloged and held. The controller who had issued the taxi clearance was placed on administrative leave during the investigation. He had not acted outside of established procedure. He had simply been one person doing the work of two, with his attention divided exactly as the system had permitted. Investigators also found a prior warning that had not traveled far enough. The FAA had recommended that airlines require an explicit heading verification step before takeoff, comparing the aircraft's actual heading against the departure runway heading on the instruments. The recommendation had existed for exactly this scenario. Comair had not adopted it. It had simply not become a requirement. In the months following the accident, the changes came steadily, in the way that aviation safety improvements have always moved, through the specific, unglamorous work of closing the gaps that a disaster has made visible. Comair revised its departure procedures to include an explicit runway verification step before every takeoff. Crews were now required to confirm, not assume, not feel confident about, but actively confirm that the runway heading matched their instruments before advancing the thrust levers. The step that had previously been treated as obvious became mandatory. The FAA had recommended it years earlier. It took 49 deaths to make it standard. Air traffic control procedures moved in the same direction. The practice of implicitly authorizing runway crossings through a general taxi clearance was identified as a systemic vulnerability. Controllers were directed toward explicit crossing instructions, clear, unambiguous language, requiring a crew to acknowledge a specific runway before crossing it. Takeoff clearances that omitted the runway number were eliminated, removing one more opportunity for assumption to substitute for confirmation. Controller training was expanded to focus specifically on surface operations. Surface movement radar and runway status lighting, technology previously deployed only at major hub airports, began spreading to smaller facilities. Bluegrass Airport itself was eventually redesigned, its intersecting runway layout reconfigured so that runway 26 no longer sat silently across the standard commercial departure path. The NOTAM that the crew had read and discussed that morning the one that had answered the first officer's quiet observation before it could become an alarm, was addressed through procedural refinements requiring more explicit crew briefings when lighting outages affected departure runways. The goal was not to make NOTAMs less informative. It was to ensure that the information they carried could not inadvertently replace the verification step it was meant to support. The heading bug on the instrument panel of that CRJ-100 read 227 degrees when the aircraft lined up on runway 26, the correct heading for runway 22, the runway they believed they were on. The instruments were accurate. The information was complete. What was missing was the procedure that would have required someone to compare both numbers at the same time. The next time you board a regional flight before dawn, in a quiet terminal, on a route that seems entirely routine, the crew up front is working through a checklist that is slightly longer than it used to be. There is a step in it that did not exist before August 2006. It takes perhaps 5 seconds. It asks them to confirm that the heading they are pointed at matches the runway they are cleared to use. 5 seconds, paid for in full. If you want to understand how aviation becomes safer, not by eliminating human error, but by building the structures that catch it before it compounds, stay with this channel. The next accident is already waiting.